The streets of the neighborhood were as busy as ever. Old cars crawled by at a slow pace, and groups of young men leaned against the walls of rundown brick buildings, chatting quietly while keeping a watchful eye on the side streets. It was a typical day, with the sun beating down on the asphalt, kicking up dust with every heavy footstep. This was where Raphael had grown up, a neighborhood in the heart of the city, dominated by drug trafficking and violence. Miguel, a veteran cop who had patrolled these streets for years, knew every corner, every alley, and pretty much everyone who lived there. This was one of those neighborhoods that seemed stuck in a cycle of poverty, where crime thrived on hopelessness and opportunities were few and far between. He had seen too many promising young people get swallowed up by gangs, lured by quick cash and the false sense of belonging. But there was still something in Miguel that wouldn't let him give up entirely. He believed that somehow he could still make a difference. One late afternoon, while on his regular patrol, Miguel stopped for a moment as he passed by a dirt lot wedged between two buildings. It was an improvised soccer field with two goals made of old wooden planks and lines drawn in the dust. A group of boys was playing soccer, sweaty and laughing out loud. Among them, Miguel noticed one boy who stood out, Raphael. He ran fast, dribbled with impressive ease, and had a powerful kick that caught Miguel's eye. The boy dominated the field with a natural talent, as if soccer was his only escape from the harsh reality of the neighborhood. Miguel crossed his arms and watched in silence for a few minutes. He had seen Raphael before, usually hanging out with other boys who were clearly involved with the local gang. It was only a matter of time before he would get pulled in all the way. Another wasted talent, lost to crime, Miguel thought bitterly, but something made him hesitate. Raphael was different. There was an energy in him, a determination Miguel recognized. Maybe, just maybe, the boys still had a chance. After the game ended and the boys started to scatter, Miguel slowly made his way toward Raphael. The boy was sitting on the edge of the field, wiping sweat off his face with his torn shirt. Miguel crouched down beside him, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Raphael knew who Miguel was. He had seen him around and knew he was a cop, but he had never had a reason to talk to him directly. "You're pretty good," Miguel finally broke the silence, still looking out at the field. "Better than most kids I've seen around here." Raphael shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "Doesn't mean much, does it?" he replied in a resigned tone. "Nobody gets out of here just because they're good at soccer." Miguel stayed quiet for a few seconds, thinking about the boy's words. He knew Raphael was partly right. For most kids here, soccer was just a temporary escape, not a real solution to their problems. But he also knew that a lucky few managed to make that escape happen, and Miguel believed Raphael could be one of them. "Ever thought about training for real?" Miguel asked casually, as if the answer didn't really matter. Raphael looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" "I know a place," Miguel continued, now looking directly at him. "A program that trains kids like you to play soccer seriously. You've got the talent for it. You're better than good." Raphael let out a sarcastic laugh. "Nobody pays the bills with dreams, officer." Miguel kept his gaze steady. He knew convincing Raphael wouldn't be easy, but there was something in the way the boy spoke, a hardness that seemed like a wall built out of fear and frustration. He needed to break through that wall. "Maybe not right now," Miguel replied calmly, "but you've got a choice. You can try to get out of this place on your own terms, or you can let this neighborhood decide your fate. I know what the gangs are planning, Raphael, and trust me, they're not going to take you anywhere worth going." The silence between them grew heavy. Raphael, unsure of what to say, just stared at the ground. Miguel stood up and placed a card on the bench beside the boy. "Think about it. You've got talent. Don't waste it." Without another word, Miguel turned and walked back to his patrol, leaving Raphael alone with his thoughts. The field was empty now, much like Raphael's mind as he found himself at a crossroads between his future and his present. Raphael couldn't stop thinking about what the cop had said the previous afternoon. He tried to brush it off, but Miguel's words kept bouncing around in his head. "You've got talent. Don't waste it." The card Miguel had left on the bench was still crumpled up in his pocket. He didn't know what to do with it. Part of him believed it was all just empty talk, but another part, a small but insistent part, was curious. What if there was something more out there beyond the dusty streets and the dangerous favors the gang offered? The next day, Raphael met up with his usual group of friends, many of whom were already deep into the gang. They hung out on a busy street corner, like they always did, talking about nothing important and killing time. Marcos, the local gang leader, was always lurking nearby, keeping an eye on the group from a distance. But his presence was always felt. Rafael knew that if he didn't make a decision soon, he'd be pulled into that world completely, just like so many before him. As his friends started talking about some job they had lined up for Marcos later that week, Rafael zoned out, staring at the street, lost in thought. "Yo, you all right?" said Joao, one of the guys Rafael was closest to. "What's on your mind? You look like you're somewhere else." Rafael shook his head and gave a half-hearted smile. "Nah, it's nothing. Just thinking." But really, he was thinking about that card from Miguel. He knew if he mentioned the soccer program to his friends, they'd laugh at him. They'd think he was dreaming too big, trying to escape from a reality that they all believed was inevitable. Still, he couldn't shake the thought that maybe this was his only shot. Later that day, as he walked home, Rafael pulled the card out of his pocket. It was wrinkled and worn, but the name on it was still clear. New Chance. It was a sports center on the other side of town, far from the neighborhood where he'd grown up. There was a phone number printed below the name. He stared at it for a few minutes, hesitating. Finally, he decided it wouldn't hurt to try. With his old phone in hand, he dialed the number. A cheerful man answered and quickly explained how the program worked. It was designed to help kids from tough areas, offering them a chance to train in sports like soccer, while also giving them educational and emotional support. The goal was to help them pursue careers in sports or beyond, with the discipline and values they learned during training. "Come by tomorrow. We've got a practice in the afternoon. You can check out the place, see if it's for you," the man said. Rafael paused for a moment, unsure of what to say, but then replied, "All right, I'll be there." The next day, when Rafael arrived at the address, he felt out of place. It was nothing like what he was used to. The soccer field was well maintained, the balls weren't flat, and the coaches seemed to take things seriously. There were other kids there, many of them from similar backgrounds, but they had a look in their eyes that Rafael didn't see often. Hope. He didn't expect to see Miguel there, but toward the end of practice, the cop showed up, watching from a distance. After a few pointers from the coaches, Miguel approached Rafael as he drank some water. "So what do you think?" Miguel asked with a slight smile. Rafael shrugged. "It's different, but I'm not sure it's for me." "You've got time to figure it out," Miguel replied, crossing his arms. "But what you did today was important. You made a decision. A lot of kids don't have the guts to do that." Rafael stayed quiet. Part of him was still skeptical. Could soccer really get him out of a life that everyone around him said was unavoidable? He looked at the other boys in the program, some younger, some his age. They were all here because, like him, they wanted to believe there was more to life than the streets and violence. Miguel noticed the doubt in Rafael's eyes and put a hand on his shoulder. "No one here expects you to change overnight, Rafael. But now you've got a choice. Every time you come here, every practice you do, you're choosing to step further away from what's pulling you in the wrong direction." Rafael nodded, still unsure of how he felt. But he knew Miguel was right. By showing up, he had made a decision, and now it was up to him to keep making that choice. Over the next few days, Rafael returned to the sports center, each time a little more determined. The practices became part of his routine, and he started to stand out among the other kids, catching the attention of the coaches. Miguel still dropped by occasionally, watching from a distance but always keeping an eye on Rafael's progress. Even though he was still hanging out with his childhood friends, something inside Rafael was beginning to change. Life on the streets, which once seemed inevitable, now had an alternative, one he couldn't ignore. Rafael couldn't remember the last time he felt this involved in something. Soccer had now become his daily routine, and practices at the sports center had turned into a crucial part of his life. Each day he felt more connected to the sport, and the physical exhaustion from training was a welcome relief compared to the constant anxiety he felt at night back in his neighborhood. But balancing his new passion with the life he had always known wasn't easy. His friends who used to support him now looked at him with a mix of confusion and suspicion because of the time he was spending at the sports center. They noticed he was hanging around the street corners less, avoiding the jobs that were starting to come up more frequently. "What, you think you're some big-time soccer player now?" Joao teased one afternoon when Rafael refused to help with a delivery for the gang. His comment was followed by a half-hearted laugh, but there was a hint of resentment in his tone. Raphael could feel the growing discomfort among his friends. "It's not like that, man," Raphael said, trying to smooth things over. "I'm just trying to do something different, you know?" Joao rolled his eyes. "Different? You think kicking a ball around is going to get you out of here? You going to forget where you came from?" Raphael knew it wasn't that simple, but what could he say? He was fully aware that even though soccer was opening doors for him, the weight of the neighborhood was still heavy on his shoulders. Now, on top of dealing with the expectations of his future in the sport, he also had to deal with the pressure from his friends and from Marcos, the gang leader, who wasn't happy about Raphael pulling away. The time Raphael spent at the sports center was the only time he really felt free from those worries. At practice, he was just another kid with a dream, sweating, running, kicking the ball with everything he had. There, he was judged by his effort and his dedication, not by where he lived or who he hung out with. The coaches noticed his progress. "You've got real potential, Raphael," one of the coaches told him during a training session. "If you keep this up, it won't be long before scouts start noticing you." Those words should have filled Raphael with excitement, but instead, they made him uneasy. What if scouts really did notice him? What if, by some miracle, he got a chance to make it in soccer? That would mean leaving everything behind: his mom, his friends, the life he knew. Was he ready for that? And even worse, would the gang let him walk away without consequences? That night, lying in bed, Raphael struggled to fall asleep. The sound of cars passing by on the street below mixed with the jumble of thoughts in his head. He knew he was at a crossroads. Soccer was offering him a real possibility, but the cost of that choice would be high. He knew that walking away from Marcos meant more than just losing friends. It meant turning his back on people who, in some ways, had also protected him. One day, after a particularly tough practice, Raphael found Miguel waiting for him at the edge of the field. The cop was leaning against a fence, watching with a serious look on his face. Raphael approached him, panting, still wiping the sweat from his face. "You're improving fast," Miguel said bluntly. "The coaches are really impressed with you." Raphael nodded but couldn't hide the worry in his eyes. Miguel, with his sharp instincts, noticed right away that something was off. "What's bothering you?" Miguel asked, looking at Raphael with concern. The boy hesitated, but he knew he could trust Miguel. "It's my friends. They're starting to look at me differently. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing both, training and the life back in the neighborhood." Miguel nodded as if he had been expecting this. "I know it's not easy, Raphael, but you've got to decide which path you want to take. No one can make that choice for you." "I know, but Marcos, he's not going to let this go easy. And my mom, if I leave, how can I make sure she's safe?" At the mention of Marcos, Miguel's expression hardened. He knew the gang leader's influence was strong and that Raphael was in a delicate situation. The cop had faced this dilemma up close before, but he wasn't ready to share everything with the boy just yet. "Raphael, I understand what you're going through, but the truth is, the further you move away from that world, the more chances you have to give your mom a better life. Marcos isn't going to give you that. He's going to squeeze everything he can out of you until there's nothing left." Miguel's words echoed in Raphael's mind as he walked home. He knew the cop was right, but making that decision would be one of the hardest things he'd ever face. Deep down, Raphael could feel that something big was coming. Soccer was opening doors for him, but the shadows of the neighborhood still loomed, and he knew his time was running out to make a final choice. The days that followed brought a growing sense of unease for Raphael. Every step he took towards soccer felt like he was pulling further away from everything he had known. But that decision, the one he was avoiding, was becoming more and more inevitable. Things in the neighborhood were changing. The vibe among the kids in the gang was getting heavier, and Raphael knew it wouldn't be long before he was forced to make a choice. One afternoon, as he was leaving his house to head to the sports center, he was stopped by Joao and two other boys he'd known since he was little. They were standing on the corner, their expressions more serious than usual. "Raphael, we need to talk," Joao said, crossing his arms defensively. "Marcos has been asking about you." Raphael felt a chill run down his spine at the mention of the gang leader's name. He knew this was coming, but he wasn't ready. He tried to stay calm as he responded, "What does he want?" "He thinks you've been pulling away too much," Joao said, clearly uncomfortable with being in the middle of this situation. "You haven't been showing up for the work lately. He wants to know why." The silence that followed was thick. Raphael looked at the two other boys who were with Joao and saw the same warning look in their eyes. This wasn't a friendly conversation. They were delivering a message. He couldn't keep ignoring Marcos. "I've just been training. That's it," Raphael said, trying to sound casual. "That's not how he sees it," Joao said, stepping a little closer. "Marcos is giving you a chance to explain yourself. But you better talk to him before things get worse." Raphael knew this moment would come, but that didn't make it any less terrifying. Marcos wasn't someone you could just blow off. His control over the neighborhood was strong, and everyone knew that crossing him came at a high price. Raphael nodded, trying to seem calm, though inside, he was anything but. "All right, I'll talk to him," Raphael said, though he had no idea when he would find the courage to actually do it. That night, he stayed home instead of going to the sports center. He was restless, pacing back and forth in his small room. His mom, who was always busy working, didn't notice the struggle he was going through. Raphael knew soccer was his way out, but Marcos was pulling him back in like an anchor, sinking him deeper into the world he was trying to escape. The next day, Raphael went to the gang's meeting spot. It was an old, abandoned warehouse, a place where Marcos and his crew gathered, far from curious eyes. When Raphael arrived, Marcos was already there, sitting in a metal chair with a cigarette in his hand, like he had been waiting patiently. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," Marcos said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Raphael took a deep breath and tried to stay composed. "I've been training, that's it." Marcos smiled, but it wasn't friendly. He got up slowly and walked over to Raphael, getting close. "I already told you I don't like betrayal. And what you're doing now, going to those practices and pulling away from the gang, sounds a lot like betrayal to me." Raphael swallowed hard, but he didn't break eye contact. "I'm not betraying anyone. I'm just trying to play soccer." Marcos laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Soccer? You really think soccer's gonna save you, kid? You think you're gonna get out of here? Make it big and live the good life while everyone else here stays stuck in the mud? You're fooling yourself. The world doesn't work like that." "I'm not trying to run from anyone," Raphael said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "I just want a chance." "A chance?" Marcos leaned in closer, his tone more threatening. "I'm going to give you a chance, but it's your last one. Tomorrow night, we've got a big job lined up. You're going to be there, and you're going to prove that you're still part of this. If you don't show, you know what happens, and I'm not just talking about you. Your mom might get hurt too. And we wouldn't want that, would we?" The threat was clear. Marcos didn't have to raise his voice or get more specific. The message was delivered. Raphael left the warehouse with his stomach in knots, unsure of what to do. Marcos's words echoed in his head as he walked down the deserted street. His life in soccer, which had once seemed like a real possibility, was now at the mercy of a decision that could put both him and his mother in danger. That night, Raphael lay awake, his mind racing. He knew that whatever choice he made, there would be consequences. Soccer or his mom's safety? His future or the dark present that was pulling him back into the shadows? The days that followed were tense for Raphael. He kept going to practice at the sports center, but the bitter taste of his conversation with Marcos stayed with him. Every time he stepped onto the field, he felt torn. On one side, soccer was giving him a way out, a real chance to dream of something better. On the other side, there was the harsh reality of his neighborhood and the consequences of trying to pull away from the gang. Miguel, always attentive to Raphael's behavior, noticed that something had changed in the boy. During one of his visits to the sports center, he found Raphael during a break, sitting on the sidelines with his head down. Miguel approached quietly, not wanting to interrupt the silence right away. He knew that sometimes just being there was more important than words. "Something's bothering you, Raphael. What's going on?" Miguel asked, finally breaking the silence in a gentle tone. Raphael hesitated. He knew he could trust Miguel, but things had gotten a lot more complicated since his last run-in with Marcos. He knew that involving Miguel might cause problems that he wasn't ready to face. "It's Marcos," Raphael said, lowering his voice. "He doesn't like that I'm pulling away. He gave me a warning." Miguel stayed quiet for a moment. The name Marcos wasn't new to him. In fact, Miguel had known the gang leader for a long time, longer than he cared to admit. Marcos was someone Miguel had once tried to save, a childhood friend with whom he had shared more than just streets and small-time schemes. The two had grown up in the same neighborhood, and for a long time they had walked the same dangerous path. Miguel and Marcos had started getting involved in petty crimes together when they were teenagers. They believed that the world of crime was their only way out, just like many young people from their neighborhood. But then a mentor stepped into Miguel's life, showing him the power of sports and the possibility of a different path. Miguel took that help and was saved by boxing. But Marcos never wanted to go down that road. He chose to stay in the game, and over time became the feared leader he was today. Miguel knew he needed to tell Rafael the truth about his past, but he wasn't ready yet. He wanted to prepare the boy first, to help him understand that he wasn't alone in his struggle. Still, the memories of his past haunted him, especially now that Rafael was becoming a target for Marcos. "Rafael, there's something I need to tell you. Something you should know," Miguel said, his voice heavier than usual. Rafael looked up, curious. He had never seen Miguel look so serious, almost vulnerable. "I know Marcos, and it's not just because he's the gang leader. We were friends a long time ago." The revelation hit Rafael hard. Friends? How? He never would have imagined that Miguel, the cop he now trusted so much, had any connection to someone like Marcos. Miguel's words hit him like a ton of bricks, and he didn't know how to respond. "You and him? You were friends?" Rafael asked, disbelief clear in his voice. Miguel sighed, looking out at the field as if he were watching his past unfold in front of him. "We grew up together. We were kids in the same neighborhood, played on the same streets. And for a while, we believed that crime was our only way out. Marcos and I made a lot of mistakes together. But I got a chance to leave. A mentor showed me sports, just like I'm trying to show you now." Rafael sat in silence, taking it all in. He had always figured Miguel had a rough past, but hearing that the cop had been so close to the life Rafael was trying to escape was eye-opening. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because," Miguel replied, turning to look directly at Rafael, "I wanted you to see the value of your choices first. I didn't want you to think that just because I made it out, you would too. It's not easy, and the reality is, not everyone makes it." Rafael understood the weight of Miguel's words. The choice he had in front of him wasn't just about soccer or crime. It was about his life, his future, and the kind of man he wanted to become. What was at stake was much bigger than he had realized. "But what about Marcos?" Rafael asked, bringing up the name that loomed over all of his decisions. "What happened between you two?" Miguel hesitated. Talking about Marcos was always painful, but he knew Rafael needed to fully understand what was going on. "Marcos and I chose different paths, Rafael. I tried to help him. When I decided to pursue sports, I asked him to come with me. I told him we could get out of this together. But he didn't want to. He was already too deep. And now he's the man running everything I tried to leave behind." Rafael felt a lump in his throat. Miguel's story affected him deeply. He was seeing firsthand the consequences of choices made in the past. Marcos had chosen crime, and Miguel had chosen sports. Now the two men were worlds apart, and Rafael found himself stuck in the middle, trying to find his way out. "So what do I do?" Rafael asked, his voice weaker than he'd like. "If Marcos doesn't let me go, what's going to happen?" Miguel took a deep breath. "You've got to decide, Rafael. But know this, if you choose sports, if you choose to get out of this life, I'll be here to protect you. I'll do everything I can to make sure you have a chance at a better future. But you need to be ready for the consequences. Marcos won't make this easy." The weight of the situation settled on Rafael in a way he hadn't felt before. He was at a crossroads, and now he understood that any wrong step could be dangerous. The only thing keeping him grounded was Miguel's presence, someone who had walked the same path and managed to escape. "I'm going to try," Rafael said, his voice more determined this time. "I'm going to keep training, but I'm scared." Miguel nodded. "I was too. Fear is part of it, but it's what makes the choice worth it." After that conversation with Miguel, Rafael spent days thinking about everything he had learned. The fact that the cop, whom he had come to trust so much, had once been childhood friends with Marcos was something he still couldn't fully wrap his mind around. How could someone who had grown up in the same environment, exposed to the same temptations, manage to break free and follow such a different path? Miguel's presence at the sports center remained constant, but there was now a new layer of tension between them. Rafael had become more introspective, weighed down by the choices he knew he had to make. He couldn't stop thinking about Marcos's words. The gang leader had made it clear. If Rafael kept pulling away, if he kept dedicating himself to soccer, there would be consequences. And those consequences didn't just affect him, they also affected his mom. One late afternoon, after a particularly tough practice, Rafael stayed at the sports center longer than usual. He wanted to avoid going back to the neighborhood. The feeling of constantly being watched by the gang was becoming unbearable. At least here, he felt safe for a few hours. He was sitting alone on the bleachers, lost in thought, when Miguel showed up again. "You've been putting in a lot of work," Miguel said, trying to break the silence. "I'm trying," Rafael replied without much energy, "but I don't know if it's going to be enough." Miguel sat down beside him, sensing that something deeper was bothering Rafael. "I get what you're going through, Rafael. When I was your age, I felt the same way. Torn, scared." Rafael looked at Miguel, curiosity finally pushing past his hesitation. "Did you really think you could make it out? Did you believe you had a chance?" Miguel sighed, looking out at the empty soccer field in front of them. "Not at first. I thought crime was all I had. Marcos and we were inseparable. But when that man came into my life, my mentor, he made me see that there were other ways to win. He showed me that sports could be a way out. I was just as lost as you, but he believed in me." Rafael stayed silent for a moment. He had always assumed Miguel had a rough past, but hearing that the cop had been so close to the life Rafael was now trying to leave behind was something powerful. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because," Miguel responded, turning to face Rafael directly, "I wanted you to see the value in your own choices first. I didn't want you to think that just because I got out, you automatically could too. It's not easy. And the truth is, not everyone makes it." Rafael understood what Miguel was saying. The decision he had to make wasn't just about soccer or crime. It was about his life, his future, and the kind of man he wanted to be. What was at stake was much bigger than he had realized. "But what about Marcos?" Rafael asked, his voice quiet. "What happened between you two?" Miguel hesitated for a moment. Talking about Marcos was always hard, but he knew Rafael needed to hear it all to truly understand. "Marcos and I made different choices, Rafael. I tried to help him. When I decided to follow the path of sports, I asked him to come with me. I told him we could leave this behind together. But he didn't want to. He was already too deep. And now he's the man running everything I tried to escape." Rafael felt a lump form in his throat. Miguel's story was hitting him harder than he had expected. He was seeing firsthand the consequences of decisions made years ago. Marcos had chosen crime, and Miguel had chosen sports. Now the two men's lives were worlds apart, and Rafael was caught in the middle, trying to find his own way out. "So what do I do?" Rafael asked, his voice small. "If Marcos doesn't let me go, what's going to happen?" Miguel took a deep breath. He knew this wasn't an easy situation for Rafael, and there were no simple answers. But he also knew that Rafael couldn't afford to let fear make the decision for him. "You've got to decide, Rafael. But understand this, if you choose to keep going with soccer, if you choose to get out of this life, I'll be here to protect you. I'll do everything I can to make sure you have a real shot at a better future. But you've got to be ready for the consequences. Marcos isn't going to make this easy for you." Rafael sat quietly, processing everything. He knew Miguel was right. He was standing at a crossroads, and whichever way he turned, there would be consequences. The decision wasn't just about him anymore. His mom's safety, his future, everything was on the line. "What if I fail?" Rafael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I can't do it, and Marcos comes after my mom? I can't leave her unprotected." Miguel shook his head, understanding Rafael's fear. "You won't be alone in this, Rafael. I'll be here. I'll be watching out for you and your mom. But you've got to be strong. Marcos will try to pull you back in, but he only has power over you if you let him." Rafael felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him like never before. He was scared, and there was no denying it. But there was also something else inside him, something that hadn't been there before. Hope. Miguel's support gave him the strength to see that a different future was possible, even if it wasn't guaranteed. "Do you think I have a chance?" Rafael asked, his voice full of doubt. Miguel looked at him, his eyes serious but filled with belief. I know you do, but only you can decide if you're going to take it or let it slip away. Raphael nodded, still unsure, but something inside him was starting to shift. For the first time, he could see that the path ahead, while filled with obstacles, was possible, and that new realization gave him the courage he needed to keep moving forward. Raphael knew he couldn't put off his decision much longer. Each day that passed, the shadows of the gang seemed to close in on him, tightening their grip with threats and suspicious glances. The practices at the sports center gave him a temporary break from the tension, but the time he spent away from the streets only seemed to make the pressure worse. That night, after a long practice, Raphael felt like someone was following him. His steps quickened, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. He was right. As he turned a corner down a more deserted street, two boys from the gang appeared, blocking his path. One of them was Joao, the friend Raphael had grown up with, but the look on his face was no longer friendly. It was clear he was there on orders, and Raphael knew exactly who was behind it. "Marcos wants to talk to you," Joao said, his voice blunt. Raphael tried to keep calm, but his heart was racing. "I don't have time for this right now. I need to get home." "It won't take long," Joao insisted, his voice harder now. "You're coming with us." Raphael knew he didn't have a choice. If he refused, things would get ugly fast. With a nod, he followed the boys, his stomach in knots with every step. They led him to an old abandoned warehouse, the same place where he had last met with Marcos. The gang leader was there, sitting in a metal chair, his cold eyes locking onto Raphael as soon as he walked in. Well, if it isn't our future soccer star," Marcos said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've been hard to find lately, Raphael." "I've been training," Raphael said, keeping his voice steady despite the fear building up inside him. "That's all." Marcos smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that made you feel safe. He stood up slowly and walked toward Raphael. "I've already told you how I feel about betrayal, and what you're doing right now, going to those practices and pulling away from us, feels a lot like betrayal." Raphael swallowed hard but held his ground. "I'm not betraying anyone. I'm just playing soccer." Marcos laughed, but the sound was cold and without humor. "Soccer? You really think soccer's going to save you, kid? You think you're going to walk out of here, make it big, and leave all of this behind while we stay stuck here? You're dreaming. The world doesn't work like that." "I'm not trying to run away," Raphael said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. "I just want a chance." "A chance?" Marcos stepped closer, his tone turning more threatening. "I'll give you a chance, but it's your last one. Tomorrow night, we've got something big planned. You'll be there, and you'll show us that you're still part of this. If you don't show up, you already know what's going to happen. And I'm not just talking about you. Your mom could end up hurt too. You wouldn't want that, would you?" The threat was clear. Marcos didn't need to raise his voice to get his point across. Raphael understood perfectly. Leaving the warehouse, Raphael felt sick to his stomach, unsure of what to do. Marcos's words echoed in his head as he walked back home through the empty streets. His life in soccer, which had once seemed like a real possibility, was now hanging by a thread. His future, his mom's safety, everything was at stake. That night, Raphael couldn't sleep. His mind raced as he tried to figure out what he was going to do. He knew that whatever decision he made, there would be consequences. But he also knew he couldn't face this alone. He needed to talk to Miguel. The cop had promised to help him, and now, more than ever, Raphael needed that help. The next morning, Raphael went to the sports center earlier than usual. He waited anxiously for Miguel to show up, his heart pounding. As soon as he saw the cop arrive, he rushed over, his desperation written all over his face. "Miguel, I need to talk to you," Raphael said, breathless. Miguel immediately sensed the urgency in Raphael's voice. He led the boy to a quiet area where they could talk without interruption. "What happened?" Miguel asked, his voice calm but focused. "It's Marcos. He gave me an ultimatum. Tomorrow night they've got something big going on, and they want me to be part of it. If I don't go, he said he'd do something to my mom," Raphael said, his voice shaking. Miguel closed his eyes for a moment, processing the situation. He knew this moment would come, but hearing Raphael say it made it all the more real. The boy was facing an impossible choice: his freedom or his mother's safety. "I knew Marcos would try something like this," Miguel said, more to himself than to Raphael. But you're not going to face this alone. What are we going to do? Rafael asked, his voice on the verge of breaking. I can't let him hurt her. Miguel placed a firm hand on Rafael's shoulder, his eyes serious. We're going to handle it, Rafael. You're not going to cave, and we'll make sure your mom is safe, I promise. Despite his fear, Miguel's words gave Rafael a small sense of relief. Maybe with Miguel's help, he could stand up to Marcos and get out of this situation. But deep down, he knew this fight was far from over. The next day came faster than Rafael had hoped. The fear of what was about to happen made time feel like it was speeding up, and the weight of it all sat heavily in his chest. Marcos had been clear. Either Rafael showed up that night or there would be consequences. And the thought of his mom not being caught in the crossfire was enough to make him feel sick with worry. Rafael knew he couldn't give in to Marcos, but the fear of putting his mom in danger tormented him. As he walked anxiously around the sports center, his mind was full of doubts. He knew the only person who could help him now was Miguel. The cop had promised to protect him, and Rafael needed to believe that promise would be kept. When Miguel arrived at the center, he found Rafael pacing nervously, clearly shaken. The boy didn't waste any time. What are we going to do, Miguel? Rafael asked, desperation in his voice. I can't let something happen to my mom. Marcos isn't playing around. Miguel looked at Rafael with a serious expression, fully understanding the gravity of the situation. He had been in a similar position himself once, facing choices that felt impossible. But he also knew that giving in to the pressure would only lead to more fear and control. He had to convince Rafael that the only way out was to face the situation head-on. Rafael, Miguel began, his voice firm, I know this feels impossible right now, but you need to trust me. I promised you that your mom would be safe, and I'm going to keep that promise. I've got a team ready. We're watching Marcos and his crew. We won't let anything happen to her. Rafael listened, but the fear still lingered. And what if it doesn't work? What if he does something before you can stop him? Miguel put a reassuring hand on Rafael's shoulder. Marcos only has power over you if you keep letting him. He uses fear to control people. But we're ahead of him this time. My team is already in place, and we won't let him touch you or your mom. The decision still wasn't easy for Rafael. He knew that standing up to Marcos directly was like declaring war on the gang, something he had never imagined doing. But Miguel's support and the fact that the cop was so involved in protecting him gave Rafael a small glimmer of courage. Then I'm not going to show up, Rafael said, finding his voice. I'm not going to do what he wants. Miguel nodded, proud of Rafael's decision. That's the right choice. I'll walk you home tonight. We'll make sure everything is secure. And tomorrow, I'll be close by, ready for whatever happens. You're not alone in this. That night, Rafael tried to prepare himself for what would come the next day. He knew the situation was serious, but for the first time in days, he felt like there was a way out. Miguel walked him home, and when they arrived, they found Rafael's mom safe, unaware of the danger that had been hovering over them. Rafael didn't want to worry her, so he only explained what was necessary. She trusted Miguel, and knowing he was there brought her some peace. The next morning, the tension was thick in the air. Rafael knew that any moment now the gang would realize he hadn't shown up for the job they had planned. He braced himself for Marcos's reaction, imagining the worst. But the day passed without incident. Miguel and his team had been on alert, ready to act, but nothing happened. When night fell again, Rafael was emotionally exhausted but relieved. He knew he had made the right choice, and Miguel's protection had kept him safe from any immediate consequences. Still, Rafael understood that this was far from over. Marcos wasn't going to give up that easily, and the road ahead was still full of challenges. But for now, Rafael felt a flicker of hope growing inside him. He had faced the first big test, and with Miguel by his side, he believed he could keep fighting for his future. This was just the beginning. The days that followed were calmer than Rafael could have ever expected. He had been bracing for immediate retaliation from Marcos and his crew, but to his surprise, there was no sign of revenge. Thanks to Miguel and his team's careful watch, the immediate threat had been contained, at least for now. For the first time, Rafael felt like he could breathe again. He knew Marcos wouldn't give up so easily, but the fact that he had passed through that storm without giving in to the gang gave him a new sense of confidence. Miguel's support had been crucial, and from that moment on, Rafael knew the cop was fully committed to helping him find a way out of this life. At the sports center, Rafael continued to shine. The dedication that had once been divided between soccer and the pressures of the streets was now completely focused on the field. He ran harder, his kicks were more precise, and his skills as a player were starting to get noticed by everyone around him. One day during practice, something unexpected happened. A scout representing a regional soccer club showed up at the sports center to watch the young players. Rafael didn't know about it until after practice, when his coach called him over. "Rafael," the coach started with a small smile. "There's someone here who wants to talk to you." Rafael's heart began to race. He followed his coach to a quiet area where an older man, dressed in the jacket of a regional soccer club, was waiting with a clipboard in hand and a focused expression. "You've got talent, kid," the scout said, straight to the point. "A lot of talent, actually. I've had my eye on you for a while, and today confirmed what I suspected." Rafael, nervous, glanced over at his coach for reassurance. The coach gave him an encouraging nod. "We're interested in offering you a chance to train with our club," the scout continued. "You've got potential, and we think with the right support, you could go far. I can't promise anything yet, but this could be the start of something big if you're willing to put in the work." The scout's words hit Rafael like a lightning bolt. The opportunity he hadn't dared to dream about was right there, staring him in the face. It was as if all the sacrifices, the sleepless nights filled with doubt and fear, were finally starting to pay off. I accept," Rafael replied, his voice trembling with emotion. "I want this chance," the scout smiled. "Good. We'll get everything set up, and soon you can start training with the team." After the scout walked away, Rafael stood still for a few moments, trying to take in what had just happened. It didn't feel real. Just weeks ago, he had been on the verge of being swallowed by the gang, trapped in a life he thought he couldn't escape. Now he was on the edge of something completely new, a future he had never thought was possible. Miguel found out about the news shortly after. When Rafael told him about the offer from the club, the smile on Miguel's face was full of pride. "I knew you'd get here," Miguel said, giving Rafael a firm pat on the shoulder. "You made the right choice, and now you're seeing the results." "I don't even know how to thank you," Rafael said, his voice thick with gratitude. "Without you, I wouldn't have made it this far." Miguel shook his head, humble as always. "You did the hard work, Rafael. I was just here to remind you of what you already had inside. Now it's on you to keep going." The next few days were a whirlwind of excitement and nerves. Rafael began training with the regional club, where the competition was tougher than anything he had experienced before. But his passion and determination drove him forward, and he quickly stood out among the other players. As Rafael's soccer career began to take shape, he knew there were still unresolved issues in his life. Marcos and the gang were still a lingering threat, and the fact that Rafael was pulling away from that life wouldn't go unnoticed forever. But for now, Rafael allowed himself to feel something he hadn't in a long time: hope. He was on the right path, and with Miguel by his side, he believed he could overcome whatever challenges were still ahead. Soccer wasn't just an escape anymore. Now it was his future. Days turned into weeks, and Rafael felt like he was living a new life. Soccer, which had once seemed like a distant dream, was now the center of his world. The practices at the regional club were intense, and for the first time, Rafael understood what it meant to compete at a higher level. The other players were skilled and disciplined, but Rafael stood out for his passion and his relentless drive during every game. Despite the challenges, he knew he was improving. His skills were getting sharper with each practice, and the coaches saw in him a potential that could take him far. There were still moments of doubt when he wondered if he was truly ready for this new chapter, especially when the memories of the neighborhood and the constant danger he had faced crept back into his mind. But in those moments, he remembered Miguel's words. "You're not alone." Miguel remained a constant presence in his life, checking in on Rafael's progress and offering advice when needed. Their relationship had grown stronger, and Rafael now saw Miguel not just as a mentor, but as the father figure he had never had. The cop's guidance, along with his steady support during Rafael's toughest times, had shaped the young man's new path. Rafael knew that much of what he was achieving now was because of Miguel. One afternoon, after an especially intense practice, Rafael sat on the bench at the edge of the field, watching as the other players packed up and left. The quietness gave him time to reflect on everything that had happened over the past few months. He thought about his mom, who was now safer thanks to Miguel's protection, and about how he had managed to escape Marcos and the gang's grip. It was a victory, but one that had come at a cost. Raphael knew that leaving the neighborhood behind meant walking away from parts of his identity. He had grown up on those streets, surrounded by friends who were now distant, some still trapped in the same cycles that he had managed to avoid. At times, there was a quiet ache inside him when he thought about them, especially Joao, his childhood friend, who had taken a very different path. Raphael wondered if there was still hope for Joao, or if it was already too late. But even with that sadness, Raphael knew he had made the right choice. He had fought for his future, and with Miguel's help, he had found a path that offered something much more valuable than the quick money and false respect the gang had promised: freedom. Later that same afternoon, Miguel showed up at the field, just like he often did. The cop walked over to Raphael with a small, knowing smile, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that Raphael noticed right away. "You're doing great, Raphael," Miguel said as he sat down next to him. "Have they told you that today?" Raphael smiled, but he could tell that Miguel had something important on his mind. "What's going on?" Miguel sighed, looking out at the empty field. "Marcos was arrested. We finally got enough evidence to take him and his operation down. He won't be a threat for a long time." Raphael felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was as if a giant weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Marcos, the man who had cast a shadow over his life for so long, was finally out of the picture. Raphael wasn't sure how to feel. There was part of him that still feared the gang's retaliation, but knowing that the leader was no longer in control gave him a sense of safety he hadn't felt in years. "What happens now?" Raphael asked, still processing the news. "Does that mean it's all over?" Miguel looked at him with a thoughtful expression. "It's over for Marcos, but the gangs, they always find a way to survive. You've gotten out of one danger, but you'll still have to keep fighting for what you want. There will always be challenges, Raphael. The difference now is that you know how to face them." Raphael nodded, understanding the depth of Miguel's words. Soccer had given him a new life, but Miguel was right. The world outside the field was still full of traps. But now Raphael had something he hadn't had before: a sense of purpose and a clear vision of where he wanted to go. The two of them sat in silence for a few minutes, letting the moment sink in. For Raphael, it felt like a chapter of his life was closing, and a new one was just beginning. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he knew he was ready for it. Before leaving, Miguel placed a hand on Raphael's shoulder once more, a gesture that had come to mean so much between them. "You made the right choices, Raphael. Don't forget that. Now the road is open. Go forward and keep fighting." Raphael smiled, feeling a mix of gratitude and determination. The future wasn't guaranteed, but for the first time he felt like he was in control of his own destiny. And with that realization, he knew that, no matter what, he wasn't going back. Soccer wasn't just a way out anymore. It was his present and his future, and Raphael was ready to embrace it fully. Do you know someone whose life was saved or transformed through sports? Or maybe you have your own story of how sports made a difference in your life. We'd love to hear from you. Share your experiences with us and inspire others who may be facing similar challenges. Whether it's soccer, basketball, running, or any other sport, your story could be the motivation someone needs to keep fighting for a better future.